Followers knew what we were about, or at least thought they knew what we were about, and we were underway as a sales organization. Now, I'm not going to go on and on about any of this stuff, but I'll just tell you one more, just to show you how tough things were in those days. We had no contracts because we hadn't finished all the legal language yet, having to deal with FHA, VA, financing, and the dual homeowners association. That was a brand new concept. We had an overarching homeowners association and then cluster associations, lenders, others, that was not registering with people yet. And we didn't have our contracts written so that we could literally sign somebody up and agree legally to sell them a house and get a commitment. So we had little half sheets of automatic carbons that were $250 refundable deposits. Joe, you probably remember this, probably what you did. $250 refundable deposit. Well, one night after we had opened, we stayed here till 9 o'clock at night, even in the winter, if you could imagine that. I mean, there was no ambient light. There was nothing but nothing out here. The little roundhouse on the hill, which somebody mistook for a flying saucer. That's another story. He had been drinking, and I hope he wasn't a pilot. He was looking for Dulles. But anyway, where was it? Oh yes, there was a couple that lived at Lake Barcroft in Arlington. I guess that's Fairfax. And they had come out, and they were my customer, and they seemed very interested in one of the Waterview houses. And they made an appointment to come back out, and they brought their friends that also lived in Lake Barcroft, and they looked at houses side by side, just one row back off the water in Waterview Cluster. And they both signed $250 refundable deposits, which to us was a sale, right? And I called Spencer before I left the office. They left just about 9 o'clock, and I called Spencer. I said, "Spencer, 2 sales. Can you believe it?" By the time I got home to Falls Church, and I'd been home about 5 minutes, the phone rang. It was Bob from New York. That's how much $250 deposits meant, because my relationship with Bob wasn't like it is now. Bob was somewhere in New York or in the executive office, and we saw him every now and then. But to have him call me and congratulate me on selling 2 houses, that was pretty neat. So that's the kind of things that were going on in 1964 when we sort of hit the ground running and really showed our face to the rest of the world.
Thank goodness there isn't much time left. Before there was Reston, I was out at Dulles Airport in the whole development of the airport. Specifically, I was the resident engineer on the access highway, which of course later on we tried to get on. I think that's one of the reasons Bob wanted. He said, "Go ahead and hire him. Maybe he can get us on the access highway." I failed as I did on many things. My beginning at Reston was not what you call triumphant. The first thing I did was I interviewed with Glenn for a job, and he said, "You have a lot of good things going for you, young man, but no." So I was turned down. Actually, for that job, as he said earlier, he hired Don Cummings. And later on, Don Cummings apparently was rustling through the drawers in his office, and my name and my paperwork was still there, so Don called me up. So I came on as design engineer, and every day was an adventure. As a matter of fact, through many years of Reston, every day was an adventure, but certainly in those days, it was. How many of you here remember Temporary Road? The original temporary road. Okay. What is it today? No. What is it today? It's a pathway. That's exactly right. Temporary road was the one and only access from Old Reston Avenue to all the construction that occurred around the Lake Ann area. And it was really just a clearing through the woods, big enough to get construction equipment through and anything else that was going in and out of there. We had a construction supervisor. What was his name?
Roland Clark.
Roland Clark, exactly. But there's a street here named after Roland Clark. He was the guy in charge of constructing the land development parts, the parts that I came to have something to do with. So in a way, once I got there, I was not exactly his boss, but kind of. Anyway, Roland was a guy who worked real hard. Was an old line guy. He used to be on the town council that hired him at one time, I believe. Was he not? So in Fairfax City. So it's the old Virginia boys. Anyway, Roland would come into the office and say, every now and then in the afternoon, he'd come in and say, "Fran, we got to go up, and we got a little problem out here. I want you to come see." So we'd go out through Temporary Road, go down around past the dam. All of a sudden, we'd be out in the woods. We'd stop at a hollow tree. And Roland had a pint out there every now and then. that after work, it was 4:30. The bulldozers had stopped, but Roland hadn't quite stopped yet. So we discussed what went on during the day. What other kind of things? Oh, if you got that map of the southern section? Right. When I came on, yeah.
And just keep that close to you so they can hear you in the back.
When I came on, this road was, and these roads right here in what was known as Section 2 existed. It hadn't been paved yet, but they existed here. My first job was supervising the design of what is the extension of that Section 4 here. And as Lauren had said, in the process of laying it out, I chose my lot. One of the interesting things is 602, what we know as Reston Parkway now. If you all remember, 602 north of the Dulles Access Highway was called Ridge Road at one time, long time ago. South of the Dulles Access Highway, at least we all knew it as 60-foot road. It was called 60-foot road because it was unusual in the parlance of the state of Virginia. During the 30s, when the highway department was formed, and all the roads in Virginia came under the auspices of the highway department, they impressed 30-foot right-of-ways over all roads. Why, we never found out exactly, I never heard the story of why 60-foot road got that wide a right-of-way. But it clearly was destined to be a major road someday. However, at the time, you could hardly get one Jeep through that in order to get down there. And that was, to get down here, the only way you could get there was either here or Fox Mill Road, which did exist.
Or you could take Lawyers Road, there was a ford.
It wasn't that
Lawyers Road.
Oh, that was towards the
Yeah, the Ford was down at the other end. That's the only way we got to Vienna for a number of years was on Old Lawyers Road. But if this was a gravel road, Lawyers Road would have cut through the woods, although it was one of those old 30-foot right-of-ways. And how many here remember or have heard of the story of the ghost of Reston? See, there aren't very many that have heard the story of the ghost of Reston. Yeah, you did, because I told you. I thought that's a hidden gem. When my children were in elementary school and going into high school, and that's the reason you know about it, I'm sure. There was a fable, I guess it was, about the ghost of Reston being seen.
Microphone.
Am I open? Just about here. You know where the underpass is under Reston Parkway? You know how the road dips way down? Well, of course, before that road was improved, that's what it was, big dip down. And going down old 60-foot road, when we even lived there, was an adventure. Dark, pretty obvious. But anyway, on dark nights, especially when there was fog, if you went down through that hollow, people thought they might have seen those Reston. Now, let me tell you where that came from, though. There's a real story behind that. Across from where I live, right here is where I live, across from it, right on the hill, right here, there was a nudist colony. Before there was a Reston, there was nudist colonies. And right down here, just below it, in the creek right down here, that nudist colony had actually dug out a swimming pool in the creek. Good size of this room. Anyway, but in 1953, a man murdered his wife and daughter, and there on the site, buried them on the site, was relatively quickly found out. And of course, the story of the ghost of Reston came from that murder. The man was convicted, went to prison, and after 20, 30 years, finally was released from prison. But the ghost of Reston began with that murder. And when my kids were growing up, they used to go over and play in the remnants of that old house that was there. It's all there was the foundation. But there's a marvelous house sitting over top of that, and I'll bet he doesn't know what that strange thing in his basement is doing now. I've got other little things, but I can't come up with any particularly now. I'd really like to, and I think people have questions of all of us, and I think that would be a very good thing.
Who was the ghost? Which of the murdered people was the ghost?
Whichever one you saw.
Our guys up here have the mic, so I'm just going to let them answer the questions. Let's start over here. When I hand you the mic, just hold it close so that you can hear. If you hold it down here, nobody's going to hear you. So hold the mic close, and if you could stand up and introduce yourself, that would be helpful.
I have trouble standing.
That's okay.
My name is Bob Webb. I came here in 1968. For Chuck, how did you deal with the matters of open housing in your sales business?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the great and glorious things about Reston, of course, is that from day one, Bob announced that Reston was an open community, and anyone with green money could live here. It was, remember where we were. We were in rural Fairfax County, very, very conservative in Virginia. In fact, my junior year in high school, which was 58, I'm sorry, the state of Virginia closed the public schools in order to avoid segregation and tried to privatize the public schools in the state of Virginia. And I missed the first 3 weeks, and I was sad about that, of course. First 3 weeks of school, my junior year in high school in Arlington at Washington and Lee High School. And ultimately, they stopped that nonsense, and integration began. So my senior year in high school, we had 2,600 kids in our school, 3 classes. My graduating class from Washington Lee was 970, if you can believe it. We had 3 black students. Now think about the courage it took for those 3 black students to come to Washington Lee High School in 1959 and 60. So Virginia was not exactly what you would call accepting of the whole idea of integration, and there were no fair housing laws. So literally, if someone wanted to buy a house and you looked at it and said, I don't like the color of your hair, no. Or I don't like your religion, or I don't like where you came from. It didn't matter. They could deny selling you a house for any reason. And that wasn't just an individual, that was anyone. So we were dealing with this in a climate when this was new. This was new, it was unusual, and it was one of the things that both attracted people and pushed people away. It was a very interesting dynamic to see who would show up on a weekend and who would look you in the eye and say something about, do you sell to colored people? And you weren't sure which side of the equation they might be on, but our answer was always the same. This is an open community. Anyone can buy a home here, and everyone's welcome to buy a home here. And in the early days, I'm going to do this very quickly because this is where we ran into the problem. In the early days, we had our own in-house sales staff, and we did not allow realtors or any real estate companies to sell houses here. There was no co-op, there was no nothing. We ran the sales operation, no one else could sell a home here, which obviously put us at odds with a very large community of real estate brokers. And we did that I think for a legitimate reason, certainly initially. It was hard enough for us to explain how Reston worked. And we figured that the confusion would be even greater if we had somebody coming in from the outside trying to explain how Reston worked, because of all the things that were going on here with common areas and dues and recreational facilities and who's going to cut your grass and you really can't paint your door a different color and all of those kinds of things that you can imagine. We were pegged as some sort of communal living place, and even one group, lots of people came in and said, is this Reston? They thought we were a retirement home. So, and I know you've all heard this too, but we used to have a cemetery. Do you remember that one? Yeah, and Bob took it off because he got mad at the funeral people. And we had a great name for it, which I thought was cool. It was Rest in Peace. So, anyway, back to the problem. So the realtors and others would use the whole idea of integration against us by saying, you really don't want to go out there to buy. You don't know who your neighbor's going to be. And you don't know what that might do to your property values. So that was going on. But the great thing about what ultimately happened here was that nobody ever made a big deal out of it, and it just happened. It was such a quiet revolution that it just all happened, and it became just the way it was. And so, although we had the issues initially, within a few years, the world caught up with us, and it really wasn't an issue. How much it hurt us initially, it's hard to say, but we just don't know.
Okay, let me hand you the mic here.
My name is Bill Martins. I've been in Reston since 1966. And I have a question for the two of you, but I just have some things that people might laugh at that I remember. Okay. And one of us,
We can't hear you.
We were the very
You're gonna
first
have to hold that
people.
close.
We were the very first people to buy a house on the lakeside.
Can't hear. Can't hear.
And Hans was the construction chief, and he lived in the very first house as you turned from the high rise. And he had 3 boys, and he had a mother-in-law and a wife. And these boys had everything in the world that a child would want. They had clothes, they had licenses. I can't imagine how they got in there. And they must have had bunk beds, and Grandma was there, and she was doing her thing. And I said to myself, this is like those clowns coming out of the little and the unbelievable. But anyway, those boys grew up there, and they seemed to fit into that house all right. And ultimately, Hans built another house.
He's right behind you.
At the end of the lake.
Yeah, the boy's right behind you.
That's unbelievable. So he maybe could explain how they got all that stuff in. But the other thing that I remember, I remembered it particularly because you talked about people knowing about Reston around the world. We were sitting on our deck looking at the lake, and along come some people from some other country, covered with cameras. I mean, they were weighted down. And they looked at us as if we were inanimate objects. And they started making photographs. And finally, the woman said she recognized that we were really alive, not props. And she stopped and she said, "Good afternoon," like that. And so, you know, people would come and they just had this feeling that this was all sort of stage sets or something. And so that was the experience that I had very early on in Reston. But the question that I have is, how is it, and it always puzzles me, that the old town of Wheeling, which is quite a coincidence in that Wheeling was here as a planned town, and we're a planned town, nobody ever thought of, till recently, of acknowledging that that was really an important association with Reston.
The Bowmans did recognize the Wheelers, and so they kept the history alive, and then, of course, Bob kept it alive, and, you know, so
I still have to
you had some Virginia gentlemen? All right. 2 bottles left? Into 5. Go ahead.
I'm Mark Schultz. I'm one of the 4 boys he's talking about. As you can see, we're all pretty long and lanky guys, and they were bunk beds. We had 2 bedrooms and a master bedroom all upstairs. 11437 Washington Plaza West. And first of all, everyone in Reston was incredible. When we got here in February of '66, Dad had all these supervisors with radios, and unlike today, we could go anywhere and do anything, and trucks would come honking on Lake Elsa or wherever I was fishing, trying to take me home. It was time for dinner. It was a real plum to bring Mark home for dinner because I'd be miles away, and we could get away with it. It was great. Steve got too big for his bunk bed, and Dad actually cut holes so his feet could fit out the end of the bunk bed. I have a real quick question for Bob. Anything that didn't happen that you wish had happened on the zoning or planning?
I'd like to start off by not answering the question.
Here, just use this one.
But to say, you get a notion of how lucky I was, fortunate, right, not lucky, to have associates like these guys. And I did move into the Bowman house, not the one on Temporary Road, but the one at the end of what they call Bowman Town Drive. Big white house. And I lived there except for weekends when I go back to New York. So now the question was,
What didn't you get in the planning and zoning that you wanted?
no, I think we got everything. I think it was absolutely astonishing. The thing is, Fairfax County had 22 planners on staff, which was quite unusual for rural counties. And anybody who had been through planning school had studied Radburn, among other things, and had studied new towns in England. So that they were more or less waiting for something like that to happen, and they were very happy to see it happening in this county of theirs. So if you think that in 14 months, from a dead start, working with the county, we had a brand new zoning ordinance and approval of our master plan and approval of our first neighborhood. 14 months. I have to say it, even though there may very well be somebody from the county here now. But 14 months, you wouldn't get a doghouse.
Supervisor, she moved into the Aaron house, and she was really on.
She wasn't there. Martha, the name before Martha.
Right.
This is ours.
Okay, other questions over on this side? Got a question?
Really a couple of comments. One problem that Bob had with the county is they forced everything along what he hates to have called the corridor, Dulles Highway corridor, have no residential, no mixed use, with a couple of exceptions, and it all had to be industrial, and it was reserved. And of course, there were problems later on because there was so much land that was reserved for nothing but industry. That's a problem in answer to that question. I'll hold off and maybe somebody might want to comment on that, but I got a couple other things.
Okay. Anybody have any questions over here? Anybody?
I just have one comment.
Okay. We'll just close, Linda.
Just part of history, you've seen a couple of the beginning of Lake Ann School. Lake Ann School was the first school in Virginia that opened integrated.
Before Lake Ann Elementary School was built, which was a year or so after the first residents were here, the kids were going to what had been a black school out in along 606, I forget the name of it now. Marcia, do you remember the name of that?
The intermediate school, or the little elementary school. That was just for 1 year or half.
Yeah.
Right, I don't remember the name.
It was just 1 year.
Almost a one square building, little tiny thing.
Yeah, one other thing that is of interest that wasn't commented on, except I think in passing, is the community center in Lake Ann. Lake Ann Hall, it was called, was built and in place, and one of Bob's early hires was Priscilla Ames, who ran that place for a long, long period of time. It had a little theater, maybe you have other recollections about it, but it was the heart of the community for quite a few years.
A lot of the Reston wives were in the community players, it was called.
Okay, got a question back here?
I was a 6th grader in Lake Ann Elementary in 1973, and I just wanted to mention that my best friend at that time was a young man named William Frazier, and he happened to be an African American, and we spent a whole lot of time together during that period, thought nothing of it, and if you had not taken the approach that you had taken, we would not have met. So your decisions have an impact.
Hi, I'm John Farrell. I live down in Buffalo Place. I'm really curious about the naming of the library. Because anybody knows anything about Virginia history, Carter Glass is not somebody who you would associate with an open housing policy. Carter Glass, 1902, they rewrote the Virginia Constitution. And in it, he said something in the convention that I can't repeat because it uses an offensive term, but he was saying, we've just passed a constitution and none of them will ever vote again. That was Carter Glass, and he put in the poll tax and the literacy test. So I'm going, okay, it's an open housing policy here in Reston, and we named the library after that guy?
I was going to say, it probably was the county, not us.
Wow.
Very few people realize that, but it bothered the heck out of me. I know that. And then there was a fight to keep Carter Glass here.
I'm sorry, I can't, hold on one second, Linda.
But that's, no, I just want to say that drove me nuts too.
All right, so you disagree.
One other thing about race relations. When the first couple of weeks we were here, I took my son down to the barber shop here to get a haircut. And the barbershop guy was, the barber was a racist. We didn't get any more haircuts here.
Okay.
I'm Hank Jones at Governor Square. How did RELAC, the cooling system, get started or get
Can we go a different direction?
Hey, when we were designing the Senate here, when Middleton and Conklin were designing the Senate here, and we had the townhouses in Hickory Cluster and Waterview Cluster. One of the major concerns, and I think probably one of the major reasons we went that way, but RELAC as it's known. Those that you don't know, it's the air conditioning system that takes water from Lake Ann, runs it through the chillers that are over in the area of the swimming pool and tennis courts here in Lake Ann Center, and then empties it back into the lake. It's one reason the waters of Lake Ann are always so warm. But one of the major reasons, in fact, the major reasons, I guess, was the noise factor. If you had to put an individual compressor beside every townhouse in Waterview Cluster or Hickory Cluster, the feeling was you couldn't very well sit out on your deck and talk to each other without being overwhelmed by the constant whir of all of the air compressors. So that's really the major reason behind it. It was, I know it included, of course, Lake Ann Village here and Hickory Cluster and Waterview Cluster. And some of the other, the Vantage Hill, did it go up that far? Right. So I know it's been a controversial thing ever since, mainly because it's turned on in May and off in October, and if you have cold or hot, other than that time, you have to suffer through it. But that, of course, it's not owned by Reston anymore. It's a private corporation and regulated by the state. But that's the story behind it. We even considered at that time, I was trying to think back, maybe Fran or Bob will remember, but I think the fellow that designed it was Blum, B-L-U-M. You remember him? That's correct. He was out in New York, I believe. I thought it's someone you brought down, Bob. But we even did some investigation or analyzing about whether or not the town center, which at that time was just a dream, would have its own power source and have its own generators and like a lot of large complexes and all do. But that was, again, dropped by the wayside, because one thing I should have mentioned earlier, we take for granted so many things, just like the
underground power lines and that we were talking about earlier and all, but it took as much negotiating with Dominion Power and CNP and those people to get the underground source of electricity and all the utilities underground here, as it did almost with the county to get the roads that we had. And of course, those pipes running to those houses to circulate that water was one other underground utility that we had. I might add one thing is just to verify what Fran said about Roland Clark. Fran wasn't the only person that Roland took to that stump. I became, later on, I became good friends of a guy named John Lawrence, who passed away last year back. He lived here in Reston. And he worked for Veatco at that time, and he was the one responsible for the underground installation of all the power lines and everything that are going through Reston. And this was years later that John told me this story. He would say he and Roland would get some really hot arguments every now and then about, you know, who should go first in doing work in a certain area, and you're in my way and I'm in your way and so forth. And said he would always end up by, Roland would say, get in my truck. John would get in his truck and they'd drive down the woods. He had one down in Hunter's Woods area too. And he would take them over and have his little pint of Virginia Gentleman, and they would talk a while and resolve the problem and then get back to, I'm not sure he always waited till 4:30 for it.
That was business he was doing there.
Hey, Glenn, tell them how big Roland was.
Yeah, Roland, I have more stories for Roland. I can spend the night here on Roland. Roland was about 6'4", 5'6", weighed at least 300, maybe 350.